Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. Would like to welcome you for joining another one of our Understanding Our New World conversations. And today we're lucky to speak to one of the most influential and respected lawmakers in Springfield, Representative Emanuel Welch. Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, John, for having me. I always enjoy the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute and all of the webinars that you offer. So happy to be a part of the series.
Great. Well, thank you. Let me just tell you a little bit about Chris, and then we will jump into the questions. Chris is a Chicagoan. He's graduated from Proviso West High School, went to Northwestern, studied hard there, entered politics, has been a member of the Illinois State House since 2013. He's been chairman of the Higher Education Committee. He's now chairman of the House Executive Committee. We might talk about that a little bit. That's kind of the power behind the throne in Springfield. And Chris has been, really one of the stalwarts in Springfield. And one thing I'd like to add, I was teasing him earlier in the day. We're developing a Hall of Fame at the Institute, and Chris is going to be one of our first honorees because in 2019, in January of 2019, we invited him to the Institute for a Pizza and Politics event. It was a day of heavy snow throughout Illinois. Chris left his house in Chicago, drove through the snow to Carbondale, was an amazing member of our Pizza and Politics event, spoke to about every student who he could talk to, maybe grabbed a piece or two of cold pizza. Then he popped in the car and drove 3 hours to Springfield where he had meetings the next day. So Chris, thank you so much for that. We will long remember your trip down here in 2019. It was really wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. The weather got better as I drove south, and the southern hospitality was very warm.
Great. Well, Chris, let's talk first about the legislative session that just passed. It was a truncated 3 or 4 day session at the end of May, and a lot of the reporting focused on the atmospherics. Lawmakers en masse, the House moving to the convention center, the Senate moving to the House. So a lot of focus was on just kind of the unusual physical aspects of the proceedings. But tell us the essential things that were accomplished during this 3 or 4 day session.
Well, I think the most essential thing that got accomplished was we kept the state on pace of passing an annual budget, which the governor has signed into law. Our goal, our number one goal, was to get to Springfield in a safe manner, to pass a state budget so that we can continue providing essential services to the people of this great state. The last thing we wanted to do was have this thing go where we end up without a budget. We did that a couple of years ago and it didn't work too well. And so we achieved our number one goal, and that was passing a budget. In a time where we're living through a public health crisis, this is not a time to go on vacation. It's a time to roll up your sleeves and work hard. And it's a time to make sure we have a budget in place, because that's a moral document. And when people need us the most, we're there.
Now, the budget itself, Chris, obviously these are hugely uncertain times. The economy is in retreat, to put it mildly. And there was a lot of extraordinary measures. I think it's premised on borrowing, like say $5 billion from the Federal Reserve and so forth. Was it viewed as sort of the best that we can do now? Let's see what the world looks like in 6 months document, or just, what were you trying to accomplish? Was it just to inject a sort of modicum of stability, or was it, did it aspire to do longer term things?
Well, there was a push by several people for us to come in and cut across the board. 32% at one point was a number that I heard. It bounced back and forth from 10% to 32%. And, when you have folks sitting at home for 10 to 12 weeks, many on unemployment, many going through the most difficult time that they've ever gone through in life, to go down to Springfield and be asked to pass a budget with 32% cuts was just not an option for many of us. So the goal was to pass a level funding budget compared to the fiscal year 20 budget. We didn't want to hurt our fine universities across this state that are just now starting to recover from that 2 years of impasse, like Southern Illinois University Carbondale. We, like Southern Illinois University Edwardsville, we didn't want to hurt any of our universities. So we funded critical state services across the board at the same level as last year. Now, yeah, being at home for 10 to 12 weeks, businesses shut down, we've lost some critical revenue. But we are expecting the federal government to do its job and pass another stimulus package that's going to include funding for state and local governments. If for some reason that does not happen, we wanted to be prepared for that. And that's why we gave the authority for the administration to borrow $5 billion from the Federal Reserve at a low interest rate if we needed to use that option. But we are still in a pandemic. That was not an easy session to pull off. It was, quite extensive, to be honest with you. And we didn't want to have members having to go back and forth. So we took care of as much as we could while we were there. And giving that authority to borrow in case we needed it was one of the important things that we had to do.
Well, Chris, I know at points you presided over the chamber. In fact, one reporter called you Dr. Cool for the way that you preside over the chamber. And there was actually kind of a provocative moment where I guess some member was declining to wear a mask and you had to make a ruling. Just briefly, what was that moment all about?
Well, Representative Bailey from the southern part of the state, he's got a loyal constituency that, they were protesting the stay-at-home orders and, the whole issue of wearing face coverings. But at the beginning of the special session, we passed a House rule that required all members to wear a face covering. And I noticed after passage of the rule that not everyone was in compliance, Democrats and Republicans. So I stood and asked if everyone would come into compliance with the rules. Everyone did except one person, and that was Mr. Bailey. So I asked him if he would come into compliance. He stood and said, I will not. I was shocked because I just figured once the House passed a rule on a strong bipartisan vote that he would come into compliance. And when he said that he would not, I just asked that he be removed until such time as he comes into compliance. And that vote passed on a strong bipartisan vote as well. And he was removed from the chamber for at least that day. But he showed up to work the next day in compliance with the rules. And the work of the people got done.
Okay. Chris, let's talk a little bit. You mentioned the state funding for education. I know that's something you were down here a couple of years ago and you did hearings both in Carbondale and Edwardsville. Give us your big picture sense of how Illinois funding for higher education is proceeding. Do you think that you referred to the impasse of several years ago? Do you feel like things are now on a pretty solid and sustainable trajectory?
I think we're on solid footing. I think we are headed in the right direction. The first and foremost, just having a budget is an important step. And now we have it 2 years in a row under Governor Pritzker. I know IUC just hired a new chancellor. Looking forward to working with him when he comes on board. I think all across our university system, there's nothing but hope present, and that's because of what they see happening out of Springfield. And I think we're going to continue to get better. We fully funded our higher education system. There's a lot of capital improvements in the capital budget for our universities, much needed work being done on each of those campuses, including the Carbondale campus. And we see students returning to our state rather than leaving. And so we have nothing but reason to be optimistic here in Illinois.
Good. Well, Chris, let's turn to sort of the big moment we're in now. And I don't even know how to label it, whether it be civil rights, racial justice, police reform. And I was struck by a letter you wrote a couple of weeks ago. And I want to read just 2 or 3 sentences and just open that up for you to just reflect on what you're thinking. Because you wrote this note, you begin by saying, the police violence, the disproportionate number of African Americans dying of the COVID-19, and the economic devastation in Black communities during this economic crisis are a poisonous stew. Can we finally address some of the underlying issues? Is this the moment? Explain what you're thinking.
Well, when I took the time to write that email, it was in response to an invitation from Rich Miller at Capitol Facts for Black Caucus members to share their thoughts on what needs to be done as a result of the current uprising across the country. And I read his column that morning, and I just immediately started typing up the response because it had been something on my mind that entire weekend. And I wrote it from the heart. And at the end of the day, as a Black man in America, seeing history repeat itself, I wanted to address the causes of what people were seeing. You're hearing people speak out in anger, but they weren't talking about why things were happening that we have been seeing on social media and in the news those previous days. And just like in 1960s, we're going through the same thing 50 years later. And the Otto Kerner Commission issued a report in 1968 that said, if we don't address institutional racism and poverty, we're going to continue to see history repeat itself. And that's what's happening in 2020. Because we have not addressed institutional racism and poverty, we are seeing the results of that poisonous stew. And so now is the time. This is a watershed moment in our nation's history. Everyone in the world saw that 8 minutes and 46 seconds of an officer's knee on a human being's neck. And they want action as a result of that. I think this is the time now where we need to address those underlying causes, or we're going to see this again repeat itself.
Well, in your essay, Chris, then you drill down on a couple issues, and I'd like us to kind of walk through them. One of them was police reform. That was, right, I think, the first. Talk to us about what you think needs to be done in this realm.
Well, I think when we talk about institutional racism, we really have to address it in the law enforcement system. The system that is created was created based on racism. It was designed to keep African Americans in this country in check during slavery and after slavery during the Jim Crow days. And many of those systems that were put in place are still in existence here in 2020. And so what we need to do is address those systematic failures. And we need a statewide police accountability system. We need a database to track police officers. We need a database where you can see if police officers have been disciplined and what they've been disciplined for, very similar to lawyers like myself. You can go to a website right now and type in any lawyer's name and you can see what that lawyer has been disciplined for. And we can't do that with law enforcement. We need to make sure police officers continue to receive training. Lawyers have to have continuing legal education. What's the continuing education requirements of law enforcement? You know, many of the things that other professions have to do are missing when it comes to law enforcement. And why is that? And why haven't we heard from the FOP since all of the uprisings have occurred saying, hey, we know that there's problems in our system and we need to protect it? That's because collective bargaining agreements need to be looked at. Collective bargaining agreements are part of the problem. And it's many mayors that I've met with have said, we'd like to get rid of these guys, but these collective bargaining agreements are hampering our ability to do so. And that's why you haven't heard from organizations like the FOP. We need to take a good, hard look at these systemic issues, particularly in law enforcement, if we're going to prevent this from happening in the future. And of course, we're going to always keep having to come back to the poverty aspect and addressing the economic issues in Black communities because they go hand in hand. You can't really separate them. They really do go hand in hand. But I think we have to look at that video of George Floyd being murdered in broad daylight and admit, no matter what race or nationality you are, we have to start with police accountability.
Chris, I want to go to economic issues in just a moment, but let's talk just on the police reform. Is this something that primarily has to occur at the local level, or is there a federal and state role? Given our federal system, how are the three kind of layers of our government, federal, state, and locals? So should they proceed on this front?
Well, I think that we can address it on both the federal and the statewide level. Under Section 1983, police officers can be held liable for actions as government officials. And I think as government officials, our Congress Can, John, are you there?
Yeah, still here.
Okay, I'm sorry, I had lost you there for a second. But, you know, our Congress can pass laws that really help us when it comes to making sure police officers are held liable for their actions. You know, there's no reasons for knees in the neck. There's no reason for chokeholds that take someone's breath away. And so under the color of authority on the federal statutes, we need to take a look at those. But also, there's things that we can do on a statewide level. I've used the example that the Illinois State Troopers are probably some of the finest police officers in our entire state. I haven't heard any complaints about our Illinois State Troopers. And when I dive deeper into that, their training is vastly different. So I think as a state, we can mandate that local law enforcement officers receive the same type of training that our state law enforcement officers do. I'd certainly like to begin that conversation with that. You know, state troopers receive 6 months of training in Springfield at the academy there. Local law enforcement receives 12 weeks of training, and then they're sent out on the streets with a badge and a gun. That's a huge difference just in their basic training. And so let's start there and say, how can we get our local law enforcement officers up to task?
Chris, I was watching a segment on PBS about this issue, and there was actually a very interesting gentleman who's a police chief in Alabama, and he said, you know, we've lost our way. He said, too many of us think that our job as policemen is to enforce punishment. He said, our job is to apprehend people who appear to be committing a crime and you know, put them into the law enforcement system. It is not our job to enforce justice. Do you think and he said, we've sort of lost that sense. I mean, is that a view that you share as well?
Well, I certainly agree that we need to change mindsets. Let's use Mr. Floyd as an example. George Floyd was being arrested for allegedly using a $20 counterfeit bill. And so we have to say to ourselves, why was he being handcuffed and treated in such a manner that ultimately led to his death over an alleged $20 counterfeit bill? Let's assume indeed it was a counterfeit $20 bill. We don't know if it was, but let's assume it was. Why wasn't that mindset, let's just give this guy a ticket and say, see you in court? Why does it get to that point that he's arrested in cuffs and the situation gets out of control? There's a whole host of the offenses that should be ticketable offenses. We need to lessen the interaction between police officers and the citizenry so that we can lessen these amounts of violent incidents between them. And it starts with going through the code, identifying instances like this and say, we don't need to be putting someone in handcuffs for that. That's a ticket. Write the ticket and they see you in court in a couple of weeks.
Chris, let's talk about the economic part of this. And over the weekend, you're making the argument that this is, in some sense, the root cause or one of the root causes of this tumultuous time, and called for, you know, an investment of $1 billion in Black communities. Talk about the economic piece, and particularly what the state of Illinois can do in terms of procurement and small business contracts, some things that can proactively be done at the state level to start making progress in this realm.
So one of the things I said earlier was trying to get to the why. And it's always important to understand the why when you hear someone talking about solutions. And one of the things I want to address is looting. People are quick to condemn the looting. I want to say up front, I don't condone it. I don't think it's ever right to break into someone's establishment that they've worked hard to open up. You know, but we have to understand why people do that. Why were people breaking into stores and stealing big screen TVs and walking out with 10 boxes of Nikes and tons of toilet paper and whatnot? Think about it. We've been home for 10 to 12 weeks. This country is going through record unemployment. Many people didn't receive a stimulus check Many people can't even get through to the IDES system because of the record volume that's flooded the system. People are broke. They're starving. They have no income coming in, but they have a landlord or a bank knocking on their door saying they're going to throw them out if they don't pay the rent or the mortgage. And so people are desperate. And as a government policymaker, we have to say, what can we do to address that? And these are issues that we've seen well before COVID-19. These are issues well before we saw looting after provocateurs and opportunists took advantage of a protest. These are long-standing issues that we have ignored. We need investment in these communities. You need to give people a job. You need to give people education. We need to make sure people have housing, affordable housing, that they don't have to worry about losing if they're out of work for a couple of weeks. And until we address those issues, again, and that's why I say they go hand in hand. Until we address the poverty issues, we're gonna see these things rise up from time to time.
Well, Chris, you also mentioned the healthcare piece of this, and that many of these communities simply do not have, access to healthcare, and these, a lot of hospitals in poor sections are underfunded. They're the first on the chopping block, as you put it. Talk about how the state can do more to improve healthcare in these communities.
Well, healthcare is critically important to everyone, but it seems like similar to education, healthcare has become one of those things for the have and the have-nots. If you're in a community like mine, our hospitals are quickly on the chopping block. A year ago, we lost a very important hospital, Westlake Community Hospital, a hospital I was born at many years ago. I won't say how many years ago, but that hospital provided critical healthcare services to Black and brown folks in my community. And 2 weeks after a new owner bought it, they closed it just abruptly. That was devastating, and those impacts are still being felt. And you're hearing it's Black and brown communities. Give me one moment. That's been hardest hit by COVID-19. So how do you address that? You have to address the healthcare disparities and continue to provide healthcare to these communities, even if they're not the highest paying communities. We have to say, from a moral perspective, when you're passing budgets, that healthcare in poor communities is a priority for you. It's the right thing to do.
Chris, on education, particularly the higher education front, is the state of Illinois doing enough to help low-income people, have access to community colleges, state universities, maybe scholarships to private universities? What can we do better on that realm?
I addressed that in my letter to Rich Miller as well. I mean, we have some of the finest universities in the entire country right here in Illinois. I mean, we have people come from both coasts and from countries around the world to attend our universities, and that's because they're the best. But if you look at our African American numbers, they're some of the worst. And I'm proud of the work that we've done that started when I was chair of higher education toward the 4-year MAP awards, the AIM High Scholarship. Those are some really good pieces that the Governor Pritzker has only enhanced. And I think that we can still do better because we have to address opening the door to more poor people into our higher education system to give them that opportunity. Do we need to look at free community college? Is that the access to education we need in the higher education space for those in poorer communities? But we can. I don't know exactly what the answer is. I have my own ideas, but I do know we need to open more doors in the community college system in our public and private universities to people of color.
How do you see these various strands coming together in the coming months? I mean, I think you have said this is a watershed moment, a pivotal moment. How does a lot of the frustration and also maybe, frankly, goodwill that's been, suggestive of these protests, how is this brought into a coherent way so there's positive, concrete results?
Well, I think the first step is happening now. I'm happy to see that the governor has been traveling around the state and participating in various protest march and listening to those communities. You have to listen to what they have to say in order to understand the policies that are going to be put on the table. There's also conversations being had with the governor in Black Caucus leadership and of course the leadership in the Senate and the House. And we're hoping that when that agenda is put on the table, that whether it's in a special session or veto session, that we have significant movement on these items because number one, the governor got out and actually heard from people what's actually needed.
Well, Chris, let's maybe shift to the federal level. And I know you're a strong, committed Democrat. If November results in a President Biden, perhaps a Vice President Kamala Harris with Democratic majorities in Congress, what would be your suggestion as to an agenda that they should advance over the next 2 years that would fundamentally turn the corner? So we start, as you say, we don't every 25 or 30 years seemingly start from scratch again. What can they do to get this fundamentally in a different direction?
Well, thank you for the question, John. And I'll take an opportunity to, say that I'm a Joe Biden delegate to the Democratic National Convention. I've never served as a delegate before. I'm really honored to be a part of the Illinois delegation that's extremely diverse from, age, race, culture, just incredibly excited about this opportunity. And being in that delegation, we have an opportunity to help shape the platform. And so if a Joe Biden or when Joe Biden wins the election, I'm pretty confident that his platform is going to reflect the views of America. It's not going to be geared toward one specific society, the 1%. We need to look at how do we help the 99%? How do we help the poor? And many of the things that we've been talking about here today, Joe Biden has come out and publicly supported. And so what I would say is someone who is supporting him at the Democratic Convention, I would expect on day one, you walk in the door and you give your cabinet officials a direction to immediately start moving on all of these issues, particularly in the housing area, in the education area. We need to address these issues immediately.
Chris, I saw an interview that Vice President Biden did today, in fact, in which he expressed deep concern about the election being conducted fairly, accurately in November. Is this something that each state just needs to focus really, really hard in making sure that its procedures are as fair and as transparent as possible, that there's as much access to voting? Is there a national solution to this, or at this point, is it just 50 states need to make sure that their elections run smoothly and fairly?
I think if the people get out and take their anger, their energy, and their excitement on many levels, and take that to the polls, there shouldn't be any fear of stealing an election. At the end of the day, people have to get up and go vote. And in many states like Illinois, we've made it easier this year because of the pandemic. We put in an option where you can vote by mail if you need to. If you feel uncomfortable going out and being around people, you have the option to vote by mail. We even made Election Day in November 2020 a statewide holiday. We did everything we can to encourage people to vote. And that's going on all across this country. And so what we need to do to avoid an election being stolen is get out and participate. Our democracy was designed to be participatory. And if we all get out and participate in it, they can't steal it. But I do think also all of the states need to, enhance their election systems. We want to make sure there's no foreign interference like there was 4 years ago, and that this election is decided by the American people and not by the Russians. And at the end of the day, I have confidence in the American people and that we're going to get out and be involved in this participatory sport.
Great. Chris, I'd like to turn to a couple questions. We've had some really good questions, and I'd love you to
Yeah.
respond to them. The first one is from Sharon from St. Louis, who asks a really kind of the most fundamental question we can imagine. And she asks, how can non-Black people learn more about the realities and experiences of Black life? She goes on to say, understandably, some of our Black friends, don't, we were reluctant to keep asking them to teach us about the experience. We don't want to kind of wear them down with that. So how can non-Blacks become better supporters and allies of this cause?
I think that's a great question. And, my mom lives in St. Louis, and so I get down there quite often. And I know that there's Black Lives Matters protests and rallies going on in St. Louis, just as they are in Chicago and all across the country. Attend a rally, get out and listen. This is a great time right now to listen to what we have to say. And every single person that's texted or called me, I have responded and given them my thoughts on the issue. And I appreciate the fact that people want to know my opinion on what I believe are some of the solutions right now. So I think that, if you want to understand what's on a Black person's mind right now, don't be afraid to text them or call them and say, give me your thoughts. We're not offended. And don't be afraid to attend a rally and hear some of the speeches, because that's where you're going to get a lot of the passion and raw feelings that are coming out of people.
I was reading about an exchange with the Senate Democratic Caucus in Springfield, apparently yesterday, in which there was a lot of this exchange in which, several white members said, tell us what your reality is. We read about it, we've heard about it, but, kind of tell us in a really visceral, personal way what your experience is.
That's right. I've shared with a number of folks my personal experiences with police officers, and they just couldn't believe that. But just being Black in America is different. When I go into a store and someone's following me around, and that someone is security, does that happen to a white person? I've never stolen anything a day in my life, but being followed around a store like you're gonna steal something is offensive. Driving and having to be trained to keep your hands at 10 and 2 when police officers are following you for no apparent reason, only other than looking like they're trying to wait for you to do something wrong to pull you over. I don't know if that happens to anyone other than a Black person. And I told this story recently of my wife. My kids are 8 and 6 now, but when my son was 2 and my daughter was a newborn, she was driving on a local road in the district. She wasn't too far from my state office, and she changed lanes without using the turn signal, and she got pulled over. She probably should have gotten pulled over, given a ticket for illegal lane change. But she got pulled over in this instance by 4 squad cars, fully armed and ready to deal with this mom with 2 small kids in the back of the car. That's quite excessive for changing lanes without a signal. Does that happen to a non-Black person in America? I don't think so. And so we really have to take a deep, hard look at these systems and say, is it just and is it equal? And if the answer is no, let's all sit down and work toward a just and equal system.
Chris, how has this experience of recent times affected your children? You mentioned you have 2 small kids. How are they processing what's happening right now?
My kids were too small to remember the incident that happened with their mom. And so all they know is being treated very well by police officers in my district. Everyone in my area knows them. They're treated like little celebrities. That's all they know. And so part of the job as a parent is to be honest with them, because they see the things that we're watching on TV and the news, and they don't understand it. One of the things that I shared was that my kids, last week took care packages to all of the police officers in our town. And I got a text from the local police chief saying that was really nice of them. And I was like, what did they do? And he said, they took packages to all of our officers. They did it without me even knowing about it, because they love our police officers. And they wanted the police officers to know that they cared about them. And that really touched me. And I think it's important they've gotten the message that not all police officers are bad. In fact, they know that most police officers are great people, and they're here to serve and protect us. But we've tried to explain to them that we do need to address the systemic problems that cause some police officers to be bad.
Well, Chris, that segues into the next question. Gwen from Granite City just asked it very simply: how can we work to change the culture of policing in America?
Yeah, you start with many of the things we talked about earlier. If they know they're going to be held accountable, if they know that they're going to be put in a statewide database and they can't bounce from just one municipality to the next, if they have to worry about being able to put food on their table, they're going to think twice, about making poor decisions. It's just natural human tendencies. And right now, the system is designed, it seems, to protect them even when they've done something bad. And we go back to the FOP. We haven't heard anything from the FOP. They have to admit that there's some systemic problems, and they should want to be willing participants in getting rid of bad police officers so that their good police officers do shine. I know I wouldn't want bad lawyers around me. I'd want to take care of them and get them out, because they take away the attention from all the good that's being done.
Chris, Sandy from Batavia asked this question, and it relates to a lot of what we're hearing now. She says, what does defunding police departments actually mean? So play off that whole really kind of phrase of defunding police departments, and do you think that point should be recast in a different direction so it actually points to some more concrete solutions?
I'll tell you, John, I personally don't like the term defund the police because I think it sends the wrong message. I think many of my Republican colleagues that have reached out with those texts and calls that want to help us on the road to reform are genuine. But when you use a term like defund the police, it'll scare them away. It'll make us lose critical votes that we need for the agenda we're going to put on the table. But let me at least explain what I believe the proponents of the term mean. What they really mean, and they mean well, is that let's take some of the dollars that are in police departments and put them in mental health services. Rather than adding another police officer on the street, maybe we need another social worker in schools. Let's just reallocate the dollars. And also, rather than another police officer on the street, let's put some of those dollars into 6 months of training as opposed to 12 weeks of training. It's a reallocation of dollars. And so when we're talking about reallocation of dollars to places that can probably actually save you in the long term, it's not really defunding the police. It's a reallocation of dollars. So we have to be really careful in our messaging so that we can make sure people know what our true meaning is and we don't lose support for our agenda.
Chris, a different topic. A bill from Illinois, from Chicago, points out. He said in the budget agreement that was recently passed, he said there was $400 million for private universities such as Northwestern and University of Chicago. Shouldn't this money be better spent on the state universities? I'm not sure exactly what that line item is. Maybe you could explain that and then just take on the broader question.
Well, Bill writes me all the time and lets me know that he's dead set against funding of private universities. But I have to tell you, someone like me, from both my parents worked 2 jobs, just to make ends meet. And my mom was a registered nurse. My dad made envelopes for a living. He literally worked 2 full-time jobs at 2 different envelope manufacturers. We barely saw our parents because they were just scrambling to make ends meet. Our family of 5 went overnight to a family of 8 when one of my aunts was killed in front of our church on the west side of Chicago. But my parents' income didn't increase. Should I be precluded from being able to attend a university like Northwestern because of my parents' inability to pay? Absolutely not. I was blessed with the opportunity to be able to attend a university like Northwestern, receive that a top education, because of assistance that you get from states like Illinois. And we have some of the best private universities in the country right here in Illinois. Northwestern's just one, University of Chicago, and many others. And I fight for all of higher ed. I love our state universities, and I hold them high. But I'm also a proud product of a private university like Northwestern, and believe the state should allow students to receive MAP grants to attend those universities as well.
Chris, has this pandemic fundamentally changed Chicago? I mean, obviously we see the dislocations now, but how do you see the next couple of years in terms of the dislocation, the economic contraction? How is the city of Chicago going to weather this storm?
Well, you know, Chicago is resilient, and this city's been around for a long time, and it's going to continue, just like the great state of Illinois. Our people are resilient. But I do have to say, this is a watershed moment in history that we're living in right now, and change is going to come, and it's going to come because you know, people understand what's happening, and they want to see change. And I'm proud of what I'm actually seeing out there right now, and I expect nothing less from the people of this great state.
Well, tell us about your work. I know one of your reputations is a consensus builder, a problem solver. Tell me about your relationships with others, maybe in downstate Illinois, whether it's central Illinois or southern Illinois, and how you try to forge a sense of, you know, common enterprise, common destiny.
You know, I think one of the things that is missing in our politics today is civility, compassion, and compromise. And, you know, I just try to live my life as an elected official, as someone who wants to do better than what we've been accustomed to. Many of my better friends in this space are in the other party. I love the fact that my Republican friends are comfortable reaching out and asking my thoughts on race, and want to have some honest discussions. That's because we've developed real relationships. And I think it's important to step outside your traditional comfort zones and make friends on the other side of the aisle, visit their districts, have them visit your district, which I do, and totally embrace our differences. But when you do that, you sit down and find that you have a lot more in common as well.
Well, tell us what your most hopeful, optimistic scenario is for, say, the next 5 years. I mean, what can, in a realistic but still hopeful sense, be accomplished in the coming period of time?
I think we can accomplish a lot in this state. I am extremely hopeful because I think Governor J.B. Pritzker is a dynamic leader. You know, to actually see our governor traveling around this state and being in some crowds that are in many times a tough crowd with some tough things to say. That's not easy to do. And I'm very hopeful on that fact alone. I'm hopeful because we have some great members of the Illinois General Assembly, both Democrats and Republicans, a lot of new young faces that are energized and amped up and lit and ready to roll up their sleeves and go to work. It's just a new place. It's exciting. Everyone wants to see change happen. I see it, I feel it. You know, we're just in a different space than we were a couple of years ago, and we're getting some real things done. I mean, just, you know, the things that we were able to accomplish in the governor's first year in office, you know, were monumental in and of themselves. And so I'm real hopeful about what lies ahead for the great state of Illinois.
Chris, how important is the vote on the progressive income tax? Is that effectively the linchpin of Illinois' fiscal future? And how do you see that vote unfolding?
Well, I think that's an important question ahead for us. As the sponsor in the last session of the bill that explained the fair tax question on this upcoming election ballot, I was proud to sponsor that initiative. The bill that I passed explains the pros and the cons. The Democrats wrote the pros, the Republicans wrote the cons. We want the people to understand why a majority of other states have a fair tax structure. I think it's critical. The fact that Illinois is, I think, one of 7 states left that has a flat tax. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why we have some of the financial issues that we have. We need to have people take a good, honest look at this question, take a look at the pros and cons and make a decision. And I certainly hope that they vote for a fair tax if they want to see some real change. And honestly, that's one of the reasons I'm hopeful for our state. I think people are going to make the right decision. The people that I talk to in my area are very supportive of this. And quite honestly, it's all about, to those who much is given, much is expected, much is required. And that's why a majority of other states have the fair tax system in place. And I believe Illinois is going to be the next one.
Do you think that the debate is, I mean, obviously right now it's been pushed to the side by the pandemic and the social justice crisis. Do you feel like it's going to, the focus on the issue is going to sharpen in the coming months so that there's a kind of a clear understanding of what the stakes are?
Well, you know, people aren't paying attention to the election yet. I mean, right now it's typical election season. We're in the summer months. You know, we haven't even reached the presidential conventions yet. But come the fall, after Labor Day, as we get closer to Election Day, people are going to be tuned in. And you can bet that, you know, there's going to be a lot of information out there for them to consume. And I believe that they're going to go into those polls very well informed on their position. And I think Illinois is going to be the next state to implement a fair tax.
Chris, I want to, as we wind this down, talk about you and through the prism of books you like. And you were a very generous participant in a project we had called Illinois Reading, in which I asked various people to recommend 5 books to help give a flavor for Illinois. And your list struck me because I want to talk about it for a couple of minutes. One, you listed 2 books on Mayor Daley, they're very different books, and also a book on Mayor Washington. So tell me about your interest in both of them. What aspects of their lives and careers most interest you about Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley, and also Mayor Washington?
You know, I have really a deep love of politics and history and an understanding of why things are the way they are and how did they get to where they are. And I'm just a junkie, I guess is the term you would use, particularly when it comes to Illinois and Chicago politics. And so my wife makes fun of me because even on vacation by the pool, she's reading magazines and you know, books. I'm reading political books, right? And I'm fascinated by all things Chicago and Illinois, and really fascinated about the history of how the Daleys came to be the Daleys. And you know, I've read pretty much everything you can think of when it comes to the Daleys and Speaker Madigan, quite honestly, as well. And of course, Senator Paul Simon. You can't be a junkie of Illinois politics and not read pretty much everything Senator Simon wrote, particularly a culture of pandering, to understand many of the problems in our politics today. And so my list is just a reflection of how much of a junkie I am when it comes to Illinois and Chicago politics.
Well, you also mentioned Mayor Washington. Was he a particularly inspiring figure for you? And did you ever have a chance to meet him, or just I know must have been a young man when he was in office, just kind of see him from afar?
Mayor Washington was elected when I was in grade school, but he died when I was in high school. And I remember the day like it was yesterday when he died. And I went home and I was glued to the TV as a young high school kid. I think I was up till 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever time it was, watching the council wars. And it just really struck me. And to now being a space where, you know, I've interacted with Chief Judge Tim Evans, who was alderman at the time and being considered for mayor, David Orr, who was the vice mayor at the time that became the temporary mayor. You know, all of this stuff still fascinates me to this day, but as a young man watching it at that time, it really, you know, intrigued me, and it just sparked my love of politics. And Mayor Washington was just a transformative figure in the African-American community, larger than life. I never met him, but certainly wish he was someone that I did meet.
Well, and the final book you mentioned was Barack Obama's Dreams from My Father. Several others mentioned that book. Have you had an occasion to meet President Obama, and how has he influenced and inspired your career?
Now, I've been honored to meet President Obama a couple of different times, and each time he's warm and inviting, and I'm honored that he actually knows my name. Uh, I'm one of those people. I always sat in the front row in class because I wanted to pay attention, and so for 8 years in the General Assembly, I've sat in the front row, and that's the only time that my seat was popular on the floor of the House was in February of 2016, when President Barack Obama came back to speak to his old colleagues. And that was just a wonderful moment in Illinois history, having President Obama come back and speak to us. And so that was a day he made the rounds and shook everyone's hands in the front row. I said, now you guys like this seat, huh? He's just a remarkable person. And I love everything about Barack Obama.
Well, Chris, as we end, tell us if you have some kind of final reflections on what this moment means to you personally, what you would urge others, what kind of contributions they can make. Just a week ago, we had Rahm Emanuel here, who said famously, don't let any crisis go wasted. I mean, use crises to do big and important things. So give us some of your concluding thoughts on what can be accomplished.
Well, I mean, one of the things I've learned in my 8 years in the General Assembly is timing is everything. And I filed bills that I filed 8 years ago that didn't go anywhere that are now, being signed into law. And so we do have to take advantage of this watershed moment in our country's history, and certainly here in the state of Illinois, and put some important policy on the table for people to vote for. Again, in my time in the legislature, I've never had as many of my Republican friends reach out and say, how can we help you on this issue? And they're genuine about it. And so we have to take advantage of that. We have to, welcome these types of opportunities. And this is what we live for, opportunities to really make powerful, impactful change in our systems. And I think we're going to get there. As Sam Cooke said, change is going to come. And I think it's coming sooner than later in this instance.
Great. Well, Chris, thank you so much. And we're going to have you down again when it's not snowing. We will make sure it's a summer or spring or fall visit. But thank you so much for being such a good friend of the Institute and for your wonderful and candid comments today. Thanks so much.
John, always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. And we'd like to thank all of you for listening to this conversation with Chris Welch. We will have this on our YouTube channel in the next couple days. So thank you so much for listening, and thank all of our supporters and friends for tuning in and helping the Institute continue the legacy of Paul Simon. Thanks so much. Have a good day.